All the Young Dudes, James's Perspective by Stay in Dreams. Chapter 10. First Year History. Saturday, October 23rd, 1971. The autumn sun had just begun its lazy descent, stretching amber shadows across the drafty stone corridors of Hogwarts. The entire castle seemed to glow, basking in the golden light of the late October afternoon. But James Potter wasn't paying the slightest bit of attention to the architecture. He was in high spirits, practically vibrating on the balls of his feet as he navigated the moving staircases. Today was the Gryffindor Quidditch team's weekly practice session, and he wouldn't have missed it for all the golden ringlets. He sprinted down the hallway, his trainer slapping against the flagstones, his chaotic dark hair tousled by the draft. A thrill of anticipation was buzzing in his chest. Next year, he thought, his jaw clenching with a precious sort of determination, I'm not going to be stuck sitting in the bleeding stands like a spectator. I'll be out there on a proper racing broom. He had pinched the upper year's training roster from the house notice board last week, and since that stroke of genius, he had made it a personal rule to attend every session. He would sit on the wooden bleachers for hours, eyes glued to the older students, absorbing every tactical maneuver and passing strategy like a sponge. In his mind, he wasn't just watching, he was training alongside them, mentally executing every perfect scoring drive. James turned a sharp corner at a breakneck sprint, daydreams of future Quidditch glory swirling through his head, and collided, boldly and hard, with something unyielding, or rather, someone unyielding. A stack of leather-bound volumes went flying through the air in an arc, and James skidded to a halt, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked up to survey the damage and grounded inside his head. Flipping heck, he thought, of all the people in this bloody castle to flap. It had to be Professor McGonagall. The deputy headmistress was standing in the center of the corridor, her severe features caught halfway between a terrifying scowl and an amused smirk. The massive pile of marking she'd been levitating a second prior was now scattered across the stone floorboards. "Mr. Potter," McGonagall said, arching a sharp eyebrow as her hawk-like eyes surveyed the mess at her feet. "I expect better from Gryffindor, running through the corridors like a headless chicken, really?" James, trying to salvage a fraction of his usual swagger, rubbed the back of his neck and offered her a sheepish grin. He knew Minnie was a soft touch for Quidditch enthusiasts, so he dedicated to lean into his own boyish charm. "Oh, Professor McGonagall, fancy seeing you here," James said, attempting to smooth down his fringe, though it immediately popped back up in all directions. Just got a bit carried away with excitement. The professor gave him an unblinking look that made it clear she wasn't buying his innocent routine for a second. "Excitement is no excuse for recklessness, Mr. Potter. Do try to remember that in the future." Feeling a tad guilty for nearly knocking the old girl off her boots, James quickly reached into his robes and wiped out his polished mahogany wand. He took a steady breath, eager to show off the advanced spellwork he had learned. "Wingardium Leviosa," James muttered, executing a flawless swish and flick. To his satisfaction, the heavy books caught the charm, floating smoothly back up into an ordered stack that hovered right beside the professor's shoulder. James beamed, thoroughly proud of his own precision. McGonagall's stern expression softened by a fraction, a hint of fondness flickering in her sharp eyes as she looked down at the messy-haired boy. "He's a handful, this one," her look seemed to say, "but he got proper talent." "Thank you, Mr. Potter," Professor McGonagall said, her Scottish tone remaining firm, but no longer unkind. "But do try to remember the rules. even when your enthusiasm gets the better of you." James nodded with exaggerated earnestness, keeping his face blank until she turned the corner. The microsecond her green robes vanished from sight, that cocky grin returned to his face in full force. Still buzzing with a dangerous amount of energy, he practically flew down the stone steps and burst out into the crisp October air, hurrying toward the massive wooden structures of the Quidditch pitch. He was half expecting to spot Sirius already lounging in their usual top-deck seats, probably hanging upside down off the railing just to cause a scene. "Black!" James called out, his voice echoing across the empty oval stadium as he jogged up the wooden steps on the Gryffindor stands. But as his head cleared the top tier, his grin faltered slightly at the edges. The benches were nearly empty, devoid of his dog-haired best mate. Instead, there was only a smaller figure huddled against the autumn child. "Peter?" James asked, slightly surprised as he plopped himself down on the wooden bench beside his friend. He noted that Pete was sitting with a thick leather notebook spread wide across his lap, his quill scratching away like mad. Peter looked up from his parchment, his pale, watery eyes instantly lighting up with relief and excitement the moment he registered James' presence. "Hi, James. You're just in time. I've been studying the lineup. Got all their strengths and weaknesses noted down," he said, his voice filled with a maniac sort of enthusiasm. James chuckled, a wave of warmth hitting his chest, and he reached out to nudge the smaller boy in his ribs. "Blimey, Pete's a proper legend for this," James thought, amused but impressed by the dedication. "Good on you, Pete. I've been watching them all week. Figured it'd be better with me on the team, though, right?" Peter nodded with absolute eagerness, his small fingers flipping through 3 separate pages of detailed notes. "Of course, I've got it all figured out. Who's likely to still be on the team next year, how the tournament might turn out, everything." James leaned back against the wooden support beams, stretching his arms behind his head and letting Peter rattle off his statistical predictions for the upcoming Inter-House Cup. James nodded along in all the right places, but internally his mind was wandering down a different track. Where on earth is Black, he wondered, a prick of irritation and boredom hitting him. Usually the two of them were inseparable during these weekend sessions. They would sit side by side, James doing his amplified impersonation of a professional ministry Quidditch commentator, while Sirius barked with laughter and threw snarky remarks at the upper year's poor broom control. Sitting here, listening to analytics was all well and good, but it wasn't the same without his brother in arms to turn it into a proper circus. "Hey, you haven't seen Sirius and Remus, have you?" James asked, pitching his voice into what he hoped was an unbothered register, and he adjusted his spectacles. Peter's quill froze against the parchment. He hesitated for a second, his round eyes darting toward the towering silhouette of the castle as if he were checking the perimeter. "They're busy," Peter said quickly, in James's estimation, a bit too bloody quickly. James frowned, his sharp radar locking onto the suspicious shift in his mate's posture. A wave of confusion hit his stomach. "Busy?" he thought, his eyebrows furrowing. Since when does Sirius Black prefer being busy inside the castle to watching a proper flying session? And since when is he doing it with Lupin of all people? "Really?" James asked, his voice dropping into a skeptical line. Peter's nervous expression shifted, dissolving into a dimpled grin. The specific look that James knew from experience usually meant some form of unauthorized trouble was brewing. "Want to grab a snack from the kitchen?" Peter offered, leaning in slightly as he closed his thick notebook with a thud. "I was down there earlier and heard the house elves were making sausage rolls." James's face lit up with unadulterated enthusiasm. "Count me in." The subterranean Hogwarts kitchen was warm and inviting, the air thick with the scent of freshly baked bread and sizzling fat. The resident house elves, far too busy preparing the evening feast, ignored the two first-years who had snuck into their territory for a quick bite. Peter sat at the edge of the long wooden table, munching on a flaky sausage roll, his brown face covered in crumbs. Meanwhile, James, already halfway through demolishing his second pastry, was recounting his latest midnight escapade with all the dramatic flair of a seasoned performer. "So there we were," James said, gesturing with his grease-stained pastry, his voice dropping into a whisper. "Just about to sneak the painting out of the restricted section when Peter cleared his throat, cutting through the climax of the tale. "You know, James, it's been a while since it's just been the two of us." James paused mid-sentence, his arm hovering in the air as he was slightly taken aback by the shift in tone. He hadn't thought much about it before, but looking at Pete's slightly slumped shoulders, he realized his mate was right. Ever since September, James had been so consumed by the whirlwind of getting to know Sirius and the mystery of Remus that he hadn't dedicated much time to the boy he'd known first. A prick of guilt hit his chest. "Yeah, I guess you're right," James conceded, offering a softer, more genuine smile as he set the remainder of his sausage roll down. It's been great getting to know them, but we'll definitely make time, I promise." Peter smiled back, but there was a bit wistful, almost fragile about the expression that made James feel a bit uncomfortable. "I'll fix it," James resolved. Believing a promise was enough to mend any fence. "Sure, James, we'll find time." But prolonged emotional gravity was too much for an energetic 11-year-old on a Saturday afternoon. Before the conversation could sink any further into melancholy, James jumped up from the bench, brushing a stray flake of pastry from his scarlet jumper and dragging Peter along by the sleeve. "Come on, let's get to the Great Hall," James urged, his boundless energy returning full force as he adjusted his spectacles. "Bet Sirius and Remus are there by now." A few moments after they'd claimed their usual spots at the Gryffindor bench, the missing duo finally materialized. Sirius looked a bit widened, his dark fringe sticking to his forehead as if he'd just executed a sprint down from the common room. Without even offering a greeting, Black grabbed a silver goblet of pumpkin juice and downed it in one massive go before finally speaking. "How was practice?" Sirius asked, his voice sounding just a touch strained at the edges, his blue eyes darting briefly to Remus before settling on the table. "Cracking," James replied, grinning from ear to ear. His suspicion from earlier vanished at the sight of his best mate. He stabbed a thick sausage with his fork and scooped up a generous helping of mashed potatoes onto his plate. "How come you didn't come?" "Homework," Sirius muttered. He picked up the gravy boat, pouring a thick brown stream over his mash with a slight frown, his eyes avoiding James's sharp brown gaze. James didn't dwell on the sketchy behavior for a second. Sirius was always behind on some transfiguration essay or another anyway, so a sudden homework crisis seemed plausible. Instead, James launched into a play-by-play recap of the upper year's Quidditch practice. He went on an unstoppable tear, listening off every player's name, their designated pitch positions, specific broom techniques, and thanks to his obsession with the sport, he even threw in their bloody birthdays. He didn't care that he was practically shouting over the dinner chatter. To James, Quidditch was the center of the universe, and his mates were required to listen. Sirius and Remus exchanged a look of long-suffering resignation. though a faint smirk began to pull at the corner of Sirius's mouth. Peter, meanwhile, proved to be the perfect audience. Pete nodded along to every tactical point, occasionally piping up with enthusiastic agreement, his round eyes wide with awe as though James was navigating the most heroic story he'd ever heard in his life. When the evening dessert finally materialized on the long oak table, James took one look at the massive platters of millionaire's shortbread and wrinkled his nose in disgust. Neither he nor Sirius could stomach the sickly sweet combination of shortbread, thick caramel and chocolate. Remus and Peter, however, seemed to lose their minds over it. The two of them practically inhaled the portions in a matter of seconds. The moment Peter realized that James and Sirius hadn't even picked up their forks, his watery eyes lit up. He didn't hesitate for a second before dragging their abandoned plates across the ridge to polish those off too. Remus shot Peter a judgmental glare, but Peter, ever the resourceful scavenger, merely grinned and reached deep into the pockets of his school robes, pulling out a bulging brown paper bag. "I've got some sweets," Peter said, offering the stash around the circle. "Mom sent them. Help yourselves." "Cheers, Pete," James said, his disappointment over the shortbread vanishing. He didn't think twice about it, reaching in to scoop up a generous handful of the colorful candies. The boys wasted no time tearing into the massive stash with ravenous appetites. They didn't stop their frantic chewing until they'd demolished a good half of the bag. It was only then that a wave of regret hit James's stomach. All four of them were feeling queasy, their faces tinting with a rather unglued greenish hue. James reached up to scratch at his chin, which had started to itch something fierce, as if a nest of doxies had taken up residence in his skin. Trying to distract himself from the irritation, he looked across at his best mate. "What homework were you doing, Sirius?" James asked, his brow furrowing as he tried to piece the timeline together. "I thought we'd finished everything for the week." Sirius, who was scratching at his collarbone so violently it looked like he was trying to burrow through his skin, responded with an unconvincing shrug. "Yeah, I was behind on history. Had to go back and check something." James' radar went off. He frowned, unconvinced. Sirius wasn't exactly the type to voluntarily lock himself in the library over a Goblin Rebellion essay, especially when they'd done all their homework together just 2 days ago. "What on earth is he blathering about?" James thought, opening his mouth to interrogate him. Before he could utter a word, Remus bolted upright from his seat, his bench scraping against the stone floorboards. He looked like he'd just seen a ghost. "What's up, Lupin?" James asked, startled by Remus's panicked movement. Remus didn't answer straight away. Instead, he stood frozen, his chest heaving as his eyes fixed in horror upon his hands. James followed his gaze and gasped. Remus's knuckles were disappearing beneath a dark coat of coarse hair. It wasn't just a bit of peach fuzz, either. Thick wool was sprouting from every spot the boy had just been scratching. James's hand flew to his chin. To his absolute shock, the skin beneath his finger was no longer smooth. It was covered in a coarse mat of hair that felt like his father's shaving brush. He was 11 years old, and he suddenly possessed a full man's beard. "Oh, bloody hell," James muttered, his eyes wide behind his spectacles as he stared down at his now furry hands, then back at the nightmare unfolding across the table. "Peter," Sirius growled, his voice dropping an octave into a raspy rumble as his aristocratic features began disappearing beneath a layer of dark fur. "Are you sure your mom sent those sweets?" Peter, who was the only one among them who hadn't touched the candies, turned a shade of crimson so violent He looked like a howler about to explode. He began sputtering uncontrollably, his hands waving in a blind panic. Well, I thought they were from her. They arrived this morning. Pete! James roared, his booming voice echoing up into the enchanted rafters. The second the shout left his mouth, the entire great hall fell silent, every head turning to stare at their section of the Gryffindor table. The murmurs and whispers started first, a low buzzing of confusion, but the sheer absurdity of the visual quickly caught up. Soon, a tidal wave of uproarious laughter followed. It wasn't long before every student in the room was craning their necks over their plates, desperate to get a better look at the three very first years. The loudest laughter, predictably, was echoing from the far side of the room at the Slytherin table. Severus Snape was howling with glee, pounding his fist against the table as he pointed at James's bearded face. Sirius, demonstrating an absurd resilience, somehow managed to stand up and look dignified even with a snot full of dark fur. He tossed his fringe out of his eyes and announced, "Come on, let's get to the hospital wing. We can plot our revenge later." James scrambled out of his seat to follow, but as they began the march down the center aisle, he couldn't help but catch Sirius's mock look as they walked past the snake's territory. James clenched his fist until his claws, or rather his furry fingers, ached. I can appreciate a good prank, James thought, his blood boiling beneath his new coat of fur. Really, I can. If Frank or one of the upper years had got them, he would have laughed along, but the indignity that Sniveler Snape, of all people, had executed a targeted strike against him was infuriating. Snape wasn't supposed to be smart enough for this kind of tactical wizardry. Pranking and psychological warfare belonged to the Marauders. It was their bloody territory. As they neared the heavy oak doors, the howls of laughter ringing in his ears, James risked a glance further down the Gryffindor bench. Lily Evans was sitting there with a group of first-year girls. She was laughing, her brilliant red hair shaking. But as her eyes locked onto James's face, a hint of concern softened her features. James felt his ears turn hot beneath the thick layers of fur. It was a horrifying sensation. I don't get embarrassed, he reminded himself, his pride taking a massive dent. I'm James Potter. I thrive on attention, even when it's at my own expense. He usually laughed it when the whole room looked at him. But standing there, looking like a rabid weasel, James realized with a jolt of confusion that he cared. Why on earth did it matter so much that Lily Evans was laughing at him? As they burst through the doors into the quiet sanctuary on the entrance hall, Sirius let out a long sigh and muttered, "Told you they'd strike back."